Vietnam. For 8 years, beginning in 1965, large numbers of American combat troops fought a bloody war in Southeast Asia. No U.S. war was longer. None sparked more strife at home. To understand how the United States became involved in a war halfway around the world, it's necessary to look back at Vietnam's turbulent history. Although Vietnam was always a separate country, foreign intruders, first the Chinese and then the French in the 18th century, occupied it for much of its history. The French exploited Vietnam's workforce and natural resources to reap large profits at the country's expense, and many Vietnamese began demanding their independence as early as the 1920s. The independence movement picked up steam during World War II when the Japanese occupied the country, reducing the authority of French officials. Ho Chi Minh, a young nationalist leader and head of Vietnam's Communist Party, took advantage of the situation to form an organization called the Vietnam Independence League, or the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh's goals emphasized national independence and reforms that they said would allow the peasants to live better lives. When World War II ended, Vietnam returned to French control. Ho and his followers were determined not to allow the French to reconquer their country and declared Vietnam independent, sparking an 8-year war with the French. The war ended in 1954 when the French, after suffering heavy losses to the Viet Minh, agreed to negotiate. A conference in Geneva, Switzerland followed where the Viet Minh and France hammered out a temporary agreement that divided the country in two. The Viet Minh took control of Vietnam's northern, more industrialized provinces, while the French and their Vietnamese supporters took control of the mostly rural southern provinces. This temporary solution was supposed to be resolved in national elections to reunify the country in 1956. In the 10 years that followed the Geneva Agreement, Ho Chi Minh set about building a communist society in the north, a society in which strict party control was extended to every walk of life.
He was capable of manipulation, of a certain amount of brutality, talking about a leader of an independence movement in extremely difficult circumstances, and who did what he felt was necessary in order for the movement to succeed.
In contrast with the North, conditions in the South were still very much like they had been under the French. Power and wealth remained in the hands of a small ruling class, while peasants toiled in poverty. The hardships of life in the South Vietnamese countryside made it fertile ground for Viet Minh communists who had stayed in the South or returned from the North after the war. The Viet Minh preached to the peasants that the nation's wealth should be shared by everyone equally. Many peasants agreed and soon were taking up arms against the South Vietnamese government. These peasant soldiers became known as the Viet Cong, guerrilla fighters who attacked government targets in small groups using hit-and-run tactics. And as the Viet Cong threat increased, the U.S. became increasingly involved in the conflict.